He's a professor at New York University. Eric Klinenberg, your book, Heatwave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, was translated into French in 2022. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. Let me begin by asking you, before we dive into it, about the current situation. Let's go back to 1995. You went and you studied two working class neighborhoods that touch one another.
That's right. I looked to see which people and places were most vulnerable in Chicago. And I found a really striking and surprising pattern, which is that while it was very clear that the low income, working class, and racially segregated neighborhoods in Chicago were most vulnerable, there was tremendous variation among those neighborhoods. And what I discovered after a lot of research is that the places that were most at risk of having a lot of deaths, they looked depleted, almost bombed out. They lacked what I came to think of as social infrastructure that would help bring people together so that they could care for one another. Whereas places that were very poor and vulnerable but did well had rich social infrastructure and kind of a booming public life. And what that meant is that people knew their neighbors better. They knew when someone who usually sits outside or is in a diner or on a park bench wasn't there, and it made it more likely that they'd knock on the door. And so we know what determines who lives and dies in the heat wave is not just the weather. It's these social and neighborhood and community factors as well. And I hope there are things that people are considering in France this week.
Yeah, Eric, that brings us to the heart of the discussion we had in the France 24 debate earlier this week about how this debate about air conditioning in France became a debate about whether technology is always the answer. You're saying it's human contact the answer.
Well, at the end of the day, in a heat wave, it can be the knock on the door that makes the difference between life and death. So many people who died during extreme heat are socially isolated, and some contact can help you figure out whether they need to be immersed in water or brought to a place where there's air conditioning. Of course, in France, this is especially a challenge because there's so little air conditioning residentially compared to the United States. Now, there are other factors as well. I know that in France this week, a lot of people are drowning in rivers and in lakes, and this is a different kind of issue. But fundamentally, these kind of community factors, how well we take care of each other and can look out for the vulnerable, are what's most difficult to do.
And again, it's 1995. You pinpoint one specific day, July the 13th, when the forecasters didn't see it coming. The temperature soaring to 52 degrees Celsius. What were the
Well,
lessons learned
yeah.
after that?
Well, so that was the experienced heat. That's not just the temperature. That's what it feels like to be in Chicago. And so, we learned during these heat events that it's not just temperature; it's also humidity and the dew point. And in fact, when I look at the temperature from France this week, I think it's very much like what happened in Chicago. Maybe a little bit less humidity, but the elevation in temperature from what you're accustomed to in June is striking and dangerous. Did we learn our lessons in Chicago? I mean, yes and no. There are some cities that do a better job of being prepared and sounding an alarm. Surely, Paris is much better prepared for an event like this than it was before the 2003 heat wave in France, which killed about 15,000 people, in excess of the norm. But I think what we're seeing this week in France is that it's just very hard to adapt cities quickly enough given the pace of climate change. Essentially, this week, France looks like it's on another planet. This is not a climate that it has experienced before at this time of the year. It's the hottest it's ever been, and it's sticking around. So I'm concerned not just about the high temperatures during the day, but also the very high temperatures at night, which means that people can't get natural cooling. And as fast as Paris is trying to plant trees and put in cool islands and get people exposed to water. I worry that it's too little, too late.
But you do mention 2003, which remains to this day a national trauma. At the beginning of the conversation, you talked about social contact. In 2003, people came home from their summer vacations to discover their neighbor was still in their apartment dead. And that the government really wants to avoid this time around, for people to be so isolated that no one cares about them. You said that that some cities have done better than others. Again, is 1995 only etched in the minds of people of Chicago or all the United States?
I mean, I think it's etched in the mind of Chicago some of the time and not all the time. And I don't think it's had a tremendous impact on the typical American city. I mean, heat waves are special problems for people who are concerned about disasters. They are invisible compared to earthquakes or tornadoes or floods, which means they don't generate spectacular imagery most of the time, right? The other thing is that the people who typically die from heat waves they're older, they're poor, they're socially isolated, they live in vulnerable and impoverished neighborhoods. They're people who are made invisible by the world we live in. And so we tend not to hold on to the lessons from these things very long. I think Chicago is doing a better job than it did in 1995. For sure, there's much more awareness about the heat as a public health problem across the United States and in Europe. It is a different world now than it was 30 years ago, and we've come a long way. But that said, I think what we're seeing in France this summer is just the transformation of our climate. The extraordinarily high temperatures coming in May, in June. It's more than most governments had planned for. And today, with school children still enrolled in school and active in schools in France, maybe there's less risk that families are going to flee and leave their neighbors and elderly relatives behind. But there's a lot of pain and suffering in France, and I just don't know yet what the toll will be.
All right, Eric Klinenberg, so many thanks for being with us there from New York City.
Okay, I wish you all well there.
Thank you so much.